The Seeker's Journey, a story dedicated to the people of Iran. There was once a young scholar named Sepideh who lived in Tehran, in a time when the streets echoed with voices demanding change. She worked as a researcher at one of the city's universities, spending her days in the library, poring over texts from every corner of history. The teachings of Zoroaster, the wisdom of Moses, the revelations of Muhammad, the sermons of Christ, the writings of Baha'u'llah, and the philosophies of Rumi, Attar, and Ibn Sina. Yet despite her vast reading, Sepideh felt lost. Each evening, she would return to her small apartment, surrounded by books and papers, paralyzed by the contradictions around her. Outside her window, millions marched for a secular state, for governance by merit rather than religious authority. They chanted for freedom, for the separation of faith and state, for the right to think and choose independently. Inside the library, she studied texts that had been used to justify the very system her fellow citizens were protesting against. The question haunted her: which path should I follow? One evening, during a pause in the protests, an elderly woman named Golnar came to the university library. She was a retired philosophy professor, her silver hair uncovered in quiet defiance, her eyes sharp with decades of observation. Sepideh had heard of her, a woman who had taught through the revolution, through wars, through changing regimes, somehow maintaining her integrity through it all. They shared tea in a quiet corner as the sounds of distant chanting filtered through the windows. "You look troubled, child," Golnar said gently, noticing the stack of books beside Sepideh, religious texts, political philosophy, histories of revolutions. Sepideh gestured toward the window. "Out there, people are demanding an end to religious rule. They want secularism, governance by the right people, qualified people, not clerics. But in here," she touched the books, "I study texts that billions revere. The prophets, the philosophers, the mystics. How can I reconcile these? Am I betraying something sacred by wanting what the protesters want?" Golnar set down her tea and looked thoughtfully at the young woman. "Let me tell you something I witnessed many years ago, when I was doing research in the southern provinces." She settled into her chair. "I came upon a terrible sight, a great circle of ants, thousands upon thousands of them, marching endlessly in a perfect spiral in the courtyard of an old caravanserai. They followed each other with absolute devotion, each one trusting the one before it, none daring to break away. The locals called it a death spiral, an ant mill. I watched as they marched for hours, then days, following blindly until they collapsed from exhaustion. The ground was littered with tiny bodies, yet still the survivors marched on, faithful to the trail." Sepideh leaned forward. "Why didn't they simply leave?" "Because," Golnar said quietly, "they had lost their ability to think independently. They followed the pheromone trail of the ant before them, who followed the one before that, in an endless loop. Not one of them stopped to ask, 'Where am I actually going? Is this path serving me? Should I investigate another way?'" She paused, her eyes moving to the window where the sounds of the street protests could still be heard. "This is what happens when we follow blindly, dear one, whether we follow ants, prophets, or supreme leaders." "But the prophets," Sepideh began. "Were men of their time and place," Golnar interrupted gently but firmly. "This is what we forget, what we're taught not to remember. Zoroaster spoke to the needs of ancient Persia, addressing the struggles of agricultural communities facing tribal warfare. Moses brought law to wandering tribes in the desert of Sinai. Christ preached love and compassion in occupied Palestine under Roman rule. Muhammad united fractured communities in 7th century Arabia, in a specific geography with specific challenges. Baha'u'llah called for unity and peace in 19th century Persia, speaking to the conflicts of his era." She gestured to Sepideh's books. Each spoke to the challenges of their era, their geography, their people's immediate suffering. They were reformers in their own contexts. And what did these teachers, along with the great philosophers, Rumi in his Konya, Attar in his Nishaper, Ibn Sina with his scientific mind, what did they all tell us, if we read them carefully? Sepideh thought for a moment. To think for ourselves? Exactly. Golnar's face lit up. Rumi told us to break free from imitation and find our own connection to truth. Adder's Conference of the Birds teaches that each seeker must discover the divine within themselves. Christ said, "The kingdom of God is within you." Baha'u'llah wrote extensively about the harmony of science and religion, insisting that blind imitation must be abandoned. Ibn Sina built his philosophy on reason and investigation, on empirical observation, not blind acceptance. Even Muhammad, in the Quran itself, repeatedly asks, "Will you not use your reason?" The old woman stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where millions were making their voices heard. These teachers belonged to their moments in history. Their wisdom was shaped by the problems they faced, the languages they spoke, the landscapes they inhabited. To follow them blindly into our time, with our challenges, to insist that 7th century Arabian law should govern 21st century Iran, is to join the ant mill. It is to march in circles until we perish, having never truly lived. But that's what the protesters are saying, Sepideh said, her voice uncertain. That we need governance based on merit, on expertise, on reason, not on religious interpretation. And they are right, Golnar said simply. A cardiologist should perform heart surgery, not a theologian. An economist should manage the national budget, not someone whose primary qualification is memorizing religious texts. An engineer should design bridges, a scientist should direct research institutions, an educator should shape school curricula. This isn't disrespecting faith, it's honoring competence. She returned to her seat. The question we must ask is, what did the prophets and sages actually want? Did they want eternal rulership for a clergy class? Or did they want people to think, to question, to find truth? Sepideh felt something crack open inside her. Then what should I do? What should we do? Be a student of your consciousness, Golnar said firmly, and a master of your ego. Your consciousness, your ability to observe, to question, to examine, this is your greatest teacher. Your ego, that voice that demands certainty, that fears being wrong, that wants to join the comfortable spiral of other marchers, that clings to identity over truth, this you must master. She leaned forward intently. When you face a challenge in life, in society, in governance, do you reach for a 1400-year-old text and hope it contains the exact answer? Do you search for what Rumi or Adder said and assume it applies perfectly to modern economic policy, to nuclear energy, to internet privacy, to women's autonomy? Many people do, Sepideh said quietly. And does each challenge not require its own fine-tuned solution? Golnar's voice grew passionate. Just as each disease requires its own specific cure, each problem demands its own careful analysis. You cannot cure a fever with the same treatment as a broken bone. You cannot solve modern Iran's economic challenges with the same wisdom needed for 7th century trade disputes. You cannot address climate change with texts written before people knew the Earth orbited the Sun. She stood again, pacing now. How much suffering comes from people fighting over the opinions of long-dead religious leaders and philosophers? They argue about interpretations, they divide into camps, they declare others heretics or apostates, all while marching in their death spiral, following the ant ahead of them. Meanwhile, the real problems of real people go unsolved because everyone is too busy defending their chosen trail. The brain drain, Sepideh murmured, thinking of her friends who had left Iran. The economic collapse. The restrictions on women, on speech, on thought. All continue, Golnar finished, because people are following the spiral. Because they're afraid to break away and ask, is this actually working? Are we solving problems or just marching in circles? She sat back down, her voice softening. You have guidance, Sepideh. You have your brain power. You have logical processes. You have a curious mind that hungers for truth. You have the ability to investigate, to measure, to harmonize different perspectives, to strive and work toward understanding. These 6 practices, inquiry, wisdom, harmony, measurement, investigation, and effort, these are your tools. But people will say I'm abandoning faith, Sepideh protested. Apply logic to your real-life challenges, Golnar continued. When the government makes a decision based on religious interpretation rather than expertise, ask, what are the actual results? When women are restricted from certain professions or activities in the name of religion, ask, What harm is actually being prevented, and what talent is being wasted? When economic policies are defended with religious reasoning, ask, are people eating? Do they have opportunities? Is the society flourishing? She paused. Don't rush to judge people based on whose opinion aligns with your favored teacher. Ask questions instead. Seek to understand. Be open-minded. Remember that your goal is not to win arguments but to find truth, and truth reveals itself through evidence and results, not through appeals to authority. The sounds from the street grew louder, another wave of protests beginning. Golnar walked to the window and gazed out at the crowds of people, young and old, men and women in headscarves and without, all united in their demand for change. Those people out there, she said, they're not rejecting faith. Many of them are deeply spiritual, but they're rejecting the ant mill. They're saying, we want engineers to build our infrastructure, doctors to run our health system, economists to manage our economy, educators to shape our schools. We want the right people, the qualified people, governing the country, not those who simply claim religious authority. She turned back to Sepideh. This is not apostasy. This is exactly what the great thinkers would have wanted. People using their minds, demanding systems that actually work, refusing to march blindly in circles. Never let religion obstruct you from seeking truth, Golnar said with intensity. Religion, at its best, is a finger pointing at the moon, but so many people become obsessed with a finger that they never look up to see the moon itself. The prophets and sages wanted you to find truth, to question, to investigate, not to stop searching the moment you encountered their words. Christ taught in parables to make people think, not to stop thinking. Baha'u'llah explicitly wrote that religion must be in harmony with science and reason, or it becomes superstition. She moved toward the door, preparing to leave. One more thing. Seeking truth is not enough. You must also give back. Cultivate a culture of excellence around you. Strive to achieve more through continuous learning, yes, but then share what you learn. Lift others as you climb. Question more, judge less. Help others break free from their own ant mills. Will you not stay? Sepideh asked. You could teach me. No, Golnar said with a gentle smile. That would defeat the entire purpose. You've heard the counsel of the ages, dear Sepideh. You've heard the voices in the streets. Now rise. Let wisdom be your craft. Not tomorrow, now. Not through me, through yourself. And with that, she left. Sepideh sat alone in the library, surrounded by all her books, but she no longer felt lost. She realized that her endless study had become its own kind of death spiral, marching through text after text, following the thoughts of others, afraid to trust her own mind, afraid to acknowledge what she could see with her own eyes. The great teachers hadn't given her answers to memorize. They had given her permission, even commanded her, to think. She took out her laptop and began to write, what do I truly believe, and why? What evidence supports this? What are the actual results of our current system? What would governance by merit and expertise look like? What are the real challenges facing Iran today, and what solutions does reason suggest? For the first time, she wasn't looking for what Rumi said, or what Muhammad taught, or what Christ preached, or what Baha'u'llah wrote, or what Ibn Sina concluded. She was looking at the evidence before her eyes. She was analyzing the results of policies. She was using logic and reason. She was investigating thoroughly. She would still read the great teachers, but now as fellow travelers who had walked their own paths in their own times, reformers who had challenged the orthodoxies of their eras, who had insisted on reason and questioning. She would honor them by doing as they had done, thinking courageously, questioning boldly, investigating thoroughly. Most importantly, she would never again judge someone simply because their conclusions differed from hers. She would ask them questions instead. She would seek to understand. She would remember that she, too, might be trapped in assumptions without realizing it. In the weeks that followed, Sepideh joined the conversations happening in cafes and university halls, in online forums and street gatherings. She brought not certainty but questions. She brought not religious edicts, but careful analysis. She brought not judgment, but openness. She watched as millions of her fellow Iranians, teachers, engineers, doctors, students, artists, workers, demanded something radical and yet simple: that the right people should govern the country. That expertise should matter. That governance should be based on results, not religious interpretation. That the brilliant minds of Iran, so many of whom had fled abroad, should be welcomed home to build a better future. They weren't demanding the destruction of faith. They were demanding the end of the ant mill. When people asked her, "But isn't this against Islam? Against tradition?" she would respond, "What did the Prophet himself say? Seek knowledge, even unto China. What did Rumi teach? Break free from imitation. What did Christ say? You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. What did Baha'u'llah teach? That religion and science must walk hand in hand. What did Ibn Sina practice? Scientific investigation. They were telling us to think, to question, to use our minds. That's what we're doing." And when they protested that this was too dangerous, that it was easier to simply follow the established system, she would tell them about the ant mill, about thousands dying in a perfect circle, faithful to the end, having never dared to step outside the trail and discover what else might be possible. "Rise," she would say, echoing both Golnar's words and the poem's ancient counsel. "The time is now. Make wisdom your practice. Not someone else's wisdom, yours. Not blind following, independent thinking." And one by one, people did. They stopped marching in circles. They started demanding that cardiovascular surgeons perform surgeries, not clerics. That economists manage the economy, not theologians. That the most qualified, the most capable, the most competent should lead, regardless of their religious credentials. They cultivated a culture of excellence, of continuous learning, of giving back to build the Iran they knew was possible. An Iran where reason and faith could coexist, where spirituality didn't require theocracy, where the right people governed because they had earned that right through merit, knowledge, and service. Sepideh had learned the lesson of the poem, that no path to truth is found through Zoroaster or Moses or Christ or Muhammad or Baha'u'llah alone, through Rumi or Attar or Ibn Sina alone, and certainly not through those who claim to speak for them while marching the people in endless, exhausting circles. The path to victory lies in your own mind, in your own questioning, in your own seeking. The counsel of the wise has been heard, from ancient sages and from millions in the streets. Now rise. Make wisdom your practice. Be a student of your consciousness. Master your ego. Use your brain power, your logical processes, your curious mind. Build a society where each challenge receives its fine-tuned solution, where each person is judged by their contribution rather than their conformity, where the right people govern because they are the right people, not because they claim divine authority.